Hello. Welcome to another episode of The Horrific Podcast. We're two friends who live in different places but share a love for scary movies. Each week we both watch the same movie on our own and then record a conversation together about what we liked, what we hated, if we were scared, and maybe even some larger truths about why people watch horror movies in the first place. This season we're going to be focusing on horror subgenres and how they've changed over time. Hope you enjoy it, and thanks for listening. So we've officially wrapped up our first mini series of season 13, which was about zombies. And now we are just rolling right ahead into our second mini series of season 13.
I had no idea that the first one was about zombies.
You just thought there was a strange coincidence of movies that
I thought it was good. I thought it was a good section. I was like, man, we should do one on zombies after this.
we should really look into zombies.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this time we're going on to another beloved subgenre, which I think is one that is near and dear to your heart, and that is slashers.
You're damn right. And I did some math for this one, man.
Math?
I did work for this one.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah.
I might be massively underprepared, but we'll see how it goes.
Your underprepared is still my overprepared, buddy. Yeah, I'm excited though, man. Like I've been looking, I think like when we were talking about this, discussing what we wanted to do, I think I was even like, I'll do slashers. Like I was just like, this is what I know. This is what I like. And I just want to know more about it. So this is, and I feel like it's one that a lot of people can relate to too. So might as well.
Yeah. And I think that with zombies, I definitely emerged from the last 6 episodes appreciating those movies a lot more than I had beforehand. Mm-hmm. And I think that we'll probably have the same experience with these.
Yeah.
And so
specifically like the internal strife that you deal with in zombies. That was one thing I think I had a better understanding after we finished too. So I was definitely glad we did that. And I think we'll have some things like that for slashers too.
Yeah. And when we started with zombies, I felt like that was just because it's a pretty easy story to tell. Mm-hmm. Like kind of the progression of zombie movies over time and how they started, and then when they got popular, and then when they got less popular, and then when they got popular again, and everything else. Like It's kind of a linear progression. But I feel like with slashers, things get a little weirder. And there are a lot of different subgenres that have all kind of evolved in like a somewhat intertwined way, even though they're still distinct. So you have movies about serial killers and murder mysteries and slashers and home invasion movies. And then backwoods and redneck was a category on, that site we were looking at before. And then like torture. And I feel like all of those movies sort of borrow from each other and have kind of their own traditions, but also influence each other a lot. And if you go even further back, I feel like those things were not sort of their own standalone things so much. They all kind of sprung from like the common place, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I definitely did.
So for the next couple of episodes, we're going to focus specifically on slashers and how that subgenre has developed over time. But we'll definitely be referencing movies in those other subgenres as well, because they've influenced each other so much. And we're also going to start with a couple of movies that I think you could also point at as more than just slasher, right? Like it could also be, this was a movie that was really important in the development of like home invasion movies or serial killer movies or whatever. But the through line we're going to try and focus on specifically is the slasher subgenre.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely, because there is definitely like in the research that we did for this and discussing it before recording, there's just so much. There was so much more to it than expected, which is awesome. I hope we can teach the listeners a thing or two.
Yeah. So I've got a little bit of background and setup, and this is based on some notes that you had shared with me based on stuff you'd read, and then some things that I've read as well. But I kind of want to set the scene for how we got to the movie that we're going to talk about today, which is Psycho from 1960, because it's generally thought to be kind of the first, maybe successful forefather of the slasher genre. Is that a fair assessment, you think?
Yeah, it's definitely a fair assessment.
And so kind of leading up to the history of film, getting it to explain how we got there and why it was important. The earliest days of horror can probably best be summarized by the universal monsters. There were definitely other things happening before and during, but the universal monster movies were really like the cultural force that brought horror to the most people and had the most influence on the development of horror movies in general. So from the time you think about like Bela Lugosi's Dracula and Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster and Lon Chaney as the Wolfman, these are all super iconic, very well known, very successful at the box office. And that was sort of what was driving and propelling horror movies in general. And I think one thing that was common in these movies was that the villain was something sort of fantastical. Like, there's a reason that they were called the Universal Monsters and not like the Universal Bad Guys or the, like they all had some either supernatural or metaphysical element to them. And really, a lot of them were based around humans that were also something more. And it was the something more that made them scary. And then even at that, they were often complex and sympathetic characters. So you kind of felt bad for Frankenstein's monster. It was like society that made him evil. You definitely felt bad for the Wolfman because, the human didn't even know that was happening to him for most of the movie. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that there were no movies before 1960 with just like bad normal humans. But I will tell you that as far as I know, there were no horror movies that centered around a murderous psychopath in the same way and to the same level of success as Psycho in 1960.
Yep. It's very accurate.
But you might say, in 1959, there was a British horror movie called Jack the Ripper. And what was that if not a slasher? Well, that movie did exist, and when I read about it, I watched it. And it was made on a budget of £50,000, and it looked like it. And I actually think it was kind of well directed, and it did have a little bit of blood, and it had like a pretty epic like shadow stabbing scene. But most people haven't heard of that movie, don't know much about it, and it really was focused more on like the people and what was going on outside, not on the killer himself. And I would maintain that it really is just so completely overshadowed by the impact of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho in both general popularity and success, but also influence, that Psycho is a better jumping off point to talk about the development of the genre.
Perfect. Yeah. I mean, I think the thing that comes with this too, there's like the movie you talked about in England, there's also, Peeping Tom, Homicidal. And the thing with Psycho that kind of stands out is, it was one of the first of mainstream films with, iconic image of somebody getting cut up with a knife. One thing that you and I have talked about, especially in the 100 Years of Horror, was they would use shadows for the bad things that are happening, the stabbings or the killings that are happening, or the camera would pan off.
Yeah,
similar with this one too, but it was more in your face than ever before, and so that's why we picked Psycho over doing like Peeping Tom or Homicidal. The point of this episode is just to kind of tell you where we're kind of starting off of. I'm sure that there are going to be people out there that say that it came from an earlier movie. That's totally cool and totally understandable. But for us, like, this is our starting off point. This is where we want to start off with. Basically, the way we kind of see it is, Psycho was, like you were saying before, that was the horror of the space monsters, and this is the monster is the man, and it's not in books that you're reading about. It's in film that you're seeing, and which I think kind of categorizes this categorizes as a slasher just from the main iconic killing alone, but the other things that they add throughout the film that we're going to discuss as we talk in this podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I think that it is really hard to look at modern slashers and not see a pretty direct influence kind of starting from Psycho.
I mean, even including the audio, the sound that was made when he's stabbing, and it's like,
yeah,
that's
definitely
something that's, was carried on to other films.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm super excited to talk about this one. I know we did an episode on it a long time ago, but this time we're going to revisit, kind of like we did with some of the zombie movies that we had watched previously, and look at it through the lens of its impact on the subgenre on the whole. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to do a quick introduction, and then we will all go a little mad in the details.
Love it.
In 1960, Paramount Pictures brought us Psycho, a psychological slasher horror film produced and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Psycho tells the story of a young woman who hits the road after stealing money from her company. After stopping at an off-the-beaten-path roadside motel, though, she finds out sometimes it's not safe to take a shower. As her sister and boyfriend investigate her disappearance, the story gets even weirder. This movie was made on a budget of around $800,000 and made around $50 million at the box office. It is widely regarded as an exemplary work of film and was added to the National Film Registry in 1992. It can currently be rented for streaming on Amazon Prime Video. This one, it's hard to know where to start, just because there's so much that we could talk about.
Yeah.
But one thing that really stood out to me was just the overall tone and pace. And this movie was really compelling. Like, I feel like it relied on the plot and the storytelling to keep it engaging more so than actually showing violence, right? Like, you had a couple of scenes that were pretty intense, but really a big part of this movie was the mood and the way that you kept finding out more about the story. Like, it was setting you up to believe the wrong thing.
Right.
So, you know, in the beginning, she's running away with the money and is super paranoid. And you really think the movie's going to be about her and the police and her trying to get away with this crime. And then there's a big shift when she gets to the motel and is eating dinner with Norman. And then shortly after that, you think the movie is going to be about the crazy mom and her being a murderer and Norman covering it up. And then you find out that the mom is actually dead, so you don't know who the old woman in the house is. And then there's the big, finale where you find out what's actually going on. And it just, the way that it kind of kept feeding you just a little bit more information that made you question your assumptions about what was happening, I think is a really important piece of not just slashers, but a lot of other movies that came after this, that is also like an effective way to tell a slasher story.
Yeah, I think one of the differences with this for sure is the fact that, I think like on movies that came out after this. So let's use like Maniac for example. Like, I feel like a lot of the films are like Don't Look Now or Don't Look Back, the one with Donald Sutherland.
Yeah,
you don't know much about the killers. I feel like throughout the whole thing. This, from relatively early on in the film, who he is, like and I think that adds like an extra piece to it. Like we're seeing who it is the whole time. We get to see how they act behind closed doors, in a sense. And I think that kind of adds to the fact of like we're not having to figure out who he is. Talking about the killer.
Yeah.
We're not having to figure out who he is. We can see it. We can watch it. We can, all that. And we know that it's bad to go to that hotel or the motel. We know that that's a bad situation. So I think that was something that was kind of seemed a little bit newer with this, where like you get to see the behind the scenes of the killer. You get to kind of see in their head, which is definitely something you can see influenced in films of the future, which we'll definitely get to. But what it also can do is I think it can kind of go one of two ways. Like, part of you, if you're going to hide who the monster is throughout the whole film, then I don't know if I want to know about him at the end of the film. Sometimes the mystery, or I don't want to see him too early or anything like that. Sometimes the mystery can be bad. With this one, there's no getting out. You know what's going on to the extent that something crazy is happening at this place. You might not know exactly who's doing it or exactly why, but you know that killing is happening, and that's scary.
Yeah. Well, and I think that gets taken to kind of its logical extreme with like Michael Myers. Like there was never any mystery about who Michael was, right? I mean, the whole idea with that is like, from the beginning that Michael Myers is the guy with the creepy William Shatner mask and the knife. and he will continue to be that for the duration of the movies.
Right.
And that doesn't make him less scary. In a lot of ways, it makes him more scary because he's a known quantity, but also unstoppable.
Yeah. 100%.
But another thing that I thought was done really well in this movie was just the complexity of his character.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the beginning, he really comes off as just kind of a likable dweeb. You know, like, you're just like, oh, Norman, you're being bossed around by your mom, and you're kind of a nerd, and this woman is having dinner with you out of pity. And his character really just comes off as kind of like genuine but goofy.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the movie goes on, you think, oh, his mom's his whole life, and he's a little off, but he's really the way that he is, or acting the way that he is, to try and like help her. And then as the movie progresses, then eventually you find out, like, no, he's been completely off the deep end the entire time. And his ability to have that sort of likable quality, or almost like disarming quality, like he comes across as someone that needs sympathy, not as someone that needs to be feared, really is terrifying if you stop and think about it. I mean, can you think of a more dangerous quality for a really murderous person to have, other than like you don't take them seriously as a threat? And so that on that level, I thought that Anthony Perkins just played the role so absolutely perfectly that it really worked well for this movie.
Yeah, I think that I don't know if anyone else could have pulled that off the way it did. I think, though, tying into what you're saying with the innocence, it was I noticed this time watching it too. It was the way he had like this way of walking that was almost childlike, and early on, like when you're just meeting him, and it's like hands either behind his back or kind of in his pocket, kind of like a shy little nerdy kid in a way.
Yeah.
And I think that was just perfect acting. Like, it was like, that's what we needed to not suspect what was going to happen. This killer doesn't look like a, roughed up, greased up old dude or anything. Like, this is just a normal looking, could pass as anyone, or pass off to anyone as a good person. And that's what makes it super scary.
Yeah. And there was one thing that I thought was just such a good job of him as an actor, was the scene where they're having dinner and talking, and there's that moment where it's like something shifts, and he talks about where people clicking their thick tongues or something. Like, it was a really weird way. It was almost like the words that he was choosing, like his lexicon changed, and the way he was delivering it, and like his whole persona, just for a split second, totally shifted, and then came back. And then the way the music came in with that, to all of a sudden you're not comfortable anymore, and something's off, but you don't quite know what it is I feel like just such a good example of like everything this movie did well is that the way that it could just take you into that like false sense of security, and then you get these little scenes that make you not comfortable anymore. And I think that what this sort of evolved into over time, especially in the slasher genre, is there are clearly some slasher movies where it's just blood and guts and running away the whole time. The people are in the house and they're trying to get out of the house the whole movie. But there's also movies in this genre that have the formula where it's like there's some kind of investigation, or there's some kind of other storyline happening interspersed with these moments of intense and graphic violence. And that's sort of the way of like managing. And so just that contrast of like, telling you more of the story, lulling you into a false sense of security, and then getting like super intense and grabbing your attention, and managing the pace throughout the movie that way. I feel like that's a thing you see in a lot of future slasher movies. And they did kind of the same thing in this one, but just with using these sort of subtle moments as opposed to just abject violence to, kind of like add that intense part throughout it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely a prime example of what good writing can do to horror films too. Cause I feel like that has to be added to this as well. Those little nuances that is happening, or maybe it's the directing, who knows, but yeah, it's those that adds to the intensity because at the end of this film, it's such a huge twist that you can't really give it anything away unless you really don't want to. And so I think that there was like this fine line they had to walk, and somehow they made it where it was like pretty intense, but also pretty intense, influential as well. But then, still didn't give away the big twist at the end.
Yeah, definitely. And one thing that stood out to me this time as well, kind of coming back to this one and thinking about it more of what are the things that it did that we've seen show up a lot more in slasher movies, was there was definitely a direct connection between like the mom's comments regarding, I guess, like sexual desire and temptation and women leading men astray. Like that whole level, I feel like is kind of a running theme for a lot of slashers. Like it's the promiscuous teenagers that get murdered, or it's the people who are, cheating on somebody that gets stabbed in the hotel room or whatever. Like for whatever reason, it seems like there has been a certain level of that layer to a lot of slasher movies in the future. And I had kind of forgotten that like the mom's rant that was overheard in this movie had the connection to that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing too. Like I was kind of thinking of while watching this as well. So I watched it again last night just to be prepared. And what I kind of noticed was like, I don't think it was just like the killing that was pretty influential, or like the twist. This wasn't like a typical 60s film at all. In the 60s, when I think back on like 60s media film and whatever, like, that's the beds that parents sleep on twin size beds, and everything's perfect in America.
Right. Yeah. But Ricky Lucy.
Yes, exactly. But the thing is like this whole thing was just off. Like she was meeting up in a hotel to have a little twist, and then stole money and made a run for it, and just all of it was off the whole time. So it was like completely out of the norm. And so if you think back like on the 60s and this coming out, like just think about the cojones that Alfred Hitchcock had to have to put out something that's like, this is pretty, we're going to push some boundaries pushing this out. But that's right. That's what also, not just slashers, but horror films in general, definitely stepped up their game as well. But slashers really kind of took the cake, considering what the content of this was about. If this was Night of the Living Dead and this came out, then yeah, I'm sure zombies would be maybe a little bit different. I don't know, but I'm just saying specifically, I think that's what kind of made people kind of fall in love with slashers, and just also the fact that we're all, every podcast that you hear about is a true crime podcast, I feel like, right, and so it's like it's just interesting to us, and so there's a couple of things that made this kind of a perfect storm for making slashers. Eventually making slashers popular. Yeah,
and I feel like this one also, we're going to be on the topic of things that were kind of like boundary pushing. By today's standards, there was not a lot of blood in this movie, but there was blood. Like there was murder, and it was a bloody stabbing, and then you see him having to like clean up the blood from the bathroom and stuff afterwards. I don't remember a lot of focus on blood in horror movies that I've seen that came before this one. Mm-hmm. And that's not to say that it wasn't there, but I think that's also a part of this subgenre. And I think that there is a reason why it's called like slashers and not murders. Like, I think that there is something that is just a very visceral reaction that comes with like a stabbing and bleeding.
It's a very good point. That's a very good point. Yeah.
That is at a very, very basic human biological level. And I think that when it's depicted in film, it elicits a response because it's a very personal form of violence. You know what I mean? Like stabbing somebody, in my mind, seems like it would be a totally different, or maybe, how do I not sound like someone who should go to a mental hospital as I say this?
Stop being friends with me.
But, well, we'll say that I feel like getting stabbed would be a very different type of experience than getting shot.
Oh,
Because
yeah. Even
a shot could come from anywhere, right? But like a stabbing is just so up close and personal, and I don't know, like there is something very visceral about just your natural biological reaction to that. And when the blood is there, there's something I feel like that is even amplified about like the way you empathize with that experience.
No, I think that's incredibly accurate. I mean, like I was saying, that you see that, like if you ever watch First 48 or whatever, like you hear that, like that's, they always talk about stabbings being more personal because like you're up there. You think about it, like what's the average knife length? You know, and that's not kitchen. It's like 4 inches, 4.5 inches, and that's the blade that you're stabbing with. You're right up there.
Yeah,
and I've done it, man, and it's not great.
Stabbing or getting stabbed?
A little bit of both. It was a peppered night.
Yeah. Then the last thing I had in my notes, as far as like things that I noticed in this one, kind of revisiting it and thinking about, you know, future slasher movies, was the psychological aspect. And I feel like slasher movies kind of go one of two directions. One is a person is just crazy, and that's why they're doing what they're doing, and it's some sort of like mental unbalance. The other direction is it's sort of like this faceless evil, unstoppable evil that's doing it, which would be more like a Friday the 13th type thing, or like Halloween, where it almost feels like the killer is like more an unstoppable force than they are a personalized human. Whereas I feel like this movie is very much like the personalized human, like we were talking about before, with Anthony Perkins playing that role. And at the end, where the psychologist or psychiatrist is giving the explanation that Norman Bates no longer exists, he only half existed to begin with, but now the other half is taken over. And then it ends with him just kind of sitting alone in the police station, and you hear like his internal monologue as the mom, and like the slow zoom in on his face, and it's, you know, just looking super creepily at the camera. There's something about that, the mental issues of an otherwise normal person that makes them capable of like inhuman things, that I think is another one of those like just visceral, really gets to you at like a biological survival type level that can be deeply disturbing.
Yeah.
And this movie really just pulled a lot of these elements that work on that level together and packaged them with a really compelling and interesting plot in a well-made movie. And it makes total sense why so many of these elements of it have been such big influences on movies that have come after.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right with that. And I think this is also a precursor to, you know, getting films like, you know, Strangers or Hush or,
definitely, like the home invasion type stuff.
Because, you know, like in Strangers, they, you know, when asked why are you doing this, she says because you're home. Like I think that this is you know, similar type, where almost like with Psycho, they gave him the excuse of like, you know, mom remarried, he didn't like that kind of thing. But no, it's you know, yet again, some people just want to see the world burn, and that's what this kind of is. Now, it's also a production of environment. Obviously, I think if you have a kid that's being yelled at and treated poorly, then like that's going to be, that's an option of what could happen. Some people are just born without that sense of like, you know, that connection with humans, you know, but this one is just like, no, dude's crazy. He's not possessed. He's, you know, none of this. Like, it's just crazy because in the real world, this is likely, like, this is 100% the case.
Yeah. And that's, I guess that's another good point as far as things that made this movie effective, were that I can't talk myself out of the owner of the next roadside motel I stop at could also be a psychopath.
Exactly.
And I would have no way of knowing.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like there, I can't be like, oh yeah, psychopaths don't exist, because they do. So this is the thing that you walk out of the theater thinking, okay, I now have a new thing to worry about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. 100%. And I think that's what, I know we're specifically talking about slashers, but it's not just slashers this movie affected, by any means.
Right. Yeah.
Which I think is just cool. Like, I think that's incredibly impressive to put out work like that. That's, has to be that influential.
Yeah. And like you said, and like I was kind of getting at in the intro of all this is, I feel like there are several different types of movies that all are kind of intertwined as far as their influences and how they developed and how they borrowed from each other. Slashers is mixed in there, but there's a lot of other stuff too. And that's what made this such a good first movie to talk about. And I think that next week, when we talk about, not to tip our hand too much, but a movie from the Giallo film movement, we're going to see a very similar type of thing where, yes, we are absolutely solidifying some of like the tenets of the slasher subgenre, but we're also seeing a lot of other things happening and being developed that go on and kind of branch out into their own thing too.
Yeah, exactly. And just to wrap this kind of up for the Psycho episode, one of the reasons we picked Psycho, like I was saying earlier, is like one of the first films with the iconic image of somebody with a knife cutting someone else up. There's obviously other options with like Peeping Tom, Homicidal, but there were also a few that came out shortly after this one too. You had like Bloodfest, 2000 Maniacs, Color Me Blood Red. I think those were in the 60s. So it was like, it was almost like it was like immediate influence happening. But where I'm excited about is where we're going next week, which is into the Giallo, like, because you talk about, I think that they get the rep that, they were always influenced by us 100%, but there are definitely things that I read up on that's like, oh no, we took a lot from them as well. And so that's why I'm excited for next week to discuss with that.
Yeah. And like we talked about with the zombie movies, how there was sort of the Italian zombie branch where they made like unofficial sequels and stuff, and they were just like, well, how about a lot of gore and sex, and we'll tie that, and that'll make, and I don't think any of that really had an impact on the zombie film development outside of its own little thing there. Whereas with the Giallo movies, I feel like those actually did, and they really did kind of refine some of those things. And there are a couple of directors who were part of that movement who were just absolute icons and eventually had, input and impact on and direct involvement with movies outside of Italy and outside of the Giallo movement as well. Right. And so the legacy there, I think, is a lot stronger and a lot more impactful for what came later than what was happening with zombies in Italy.
Yeah, exactly. Directors that are out there that if they were in any other genre, I really feel like would be held at a lot higher too. That's the other thing that I think is important. Yeah. I don't think that you get a lot of love, especially in this area for horrors like you do now, like director, it's an art now, and I'm thankful that they see it that way. But yeah, these people are putting stuff out and fighting the good fight against, censorship. So
yeah,
I'm excited.
Yeah. Yeah. And so much like when we were talking about Night of the Living Dead and how that was just kind of like the right movie at the right time that did a lot of really cool things from a movie making and social perspective, and then also, happened to popularize the type of horror that it was. I see a lot of parallels with this movie, but this one happened, even earlier. I'm excited. This is our first episode in our mini series on slasher movies, and I think we're off to a good start, and I am wildly excited to come back and talk about a Giallo movie by Dario Argento next week.
I just like the name Dario. I just want to put that out there. That's such a cool name.
Yeah. And that's it for today's episode. If you've listened this far, then thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed it. We're always looking for new ideas, so if you have any questions, comments, or movie suggestions, please send us an email at thehorrificpod@gmail.com, or feel free to comment on or message our Facebook page. Just search for The Horrific Podcast.
Thanks for listening.